Hello everyone, welcome to the PropTech Ramble. I'm Charlotte and I'm here with James from MSQ. Hi James, nice to have you. And do you want to give us everyone kind of a brief outline of yourself?
Sure, thank you, Charlotte. I'll try and keep it brief so we can get into it. I'm James, I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at MSQ. We're a global digital marketing group of agencies, a group of 10 agencies globally, about 1,000 people. I spend my time working on our carbon footprint modeling and our carbon reduction strategies, etc. But we'll kind of get into my journey towards that. But that certainly wasn't my background. My background is a computer scientist. I'm the co-founder of one of the larger agencies within MSQ called MMT Digital. So my background is more sort of as a techie and as an entrepreneur. And I think like a lot of chief sustainability officers over the last 5 or 10 years, it is a bit the Wild West. And so I've sort of accidentally become an expert in this area. Delighted to be here to share some of my experiences if they can be of some use.
I'm sure there will be. But obviously, we're here today to talk about sustainability, and it's hard to talk about sustainability these days without talking about COP26, which is right around the corner. Are you attending?
I'm not attending in person, doing my bit for sort of carbon footprints by not going up there. It's got a bit crazy in Glasgow. I'm also the co-chair of the BEMA Sustainability Council. BEMA is a kind of membership body for digital agencies in the UK. So we're running workshops. We're running 4 simultaneous workshops for COP26. I'll be running our one in London. We've got one in Edinburgh and online. They're not open forum, but we've got a group of experts together, which is really exciting to talk about how governments can best help businesses to help their employees and staff do more. I hope that's something we can get into as well, because I think that's really, really crucial actually, is that role that business plays to mobilize people rather than just going direct to people. I think that's really, really important and felt like a good fit for COP26. So not going to be there, but like lots of people running workshops around the fringes and in other places.
I think as well, like it's the coolest thing about COP26 is that it's been a bit of a catalyst for everyone to get these events going, and everyone's doing a lot around it. So I think, even if a lot of people can't be at the event itself, it's definitely generated a lot of discussion and pushed people along.
Well, I think if you look at hotel prices in Glasgow during COP26 as well, that's probably putting quite a lot of people off actually going into Glasgow at the moment.
Or even like
kind of crazy, but
I've got a lot of friends in Glasgow that are like renting their flats out and stuff, and
very smart.
It's a money spinner. Cool. Well, let's get into the quick fire round. So you haven't seen these before, so here we go. What was your first job?
I've only ever had one job. I fell out of university and founded MMT Digital in my bedroom with my buddy Ben, who I've known since I was 6 weeks old, who now sits on the board at MSQ. So my CV is very short.
Wow, I'm excited to talk about that later. So when/where are you most productive?
Well, that's a really good question. The short answer to that is, and I think hopefully lots of people relate to this, I'm still very involved in the exec team at MMT and the senior teams at MSQ. And I think we all kind of agreed that I'm individually the most productive, like at home without distractions, like for concentrating, both when I was a developer and a computer scientist, but today there's a lot of work that I have to do that's very complicated and heads down. But the times that I've been back into the office, it's amazing how many kind of water cooler conversations I've had. And I've realized that innovation initially for my company, MMT, really did happen in the kitchens of our offices. Every time I go down, I have 3 or 4 conversations that lead to someone going, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to go and talk to our account teams about that X, Y, and Z. And I've kind of realized that, I don't know how you measure that in terms of productivity, but that kind of definitely on my own, right where I am here at home. But there's definitely something about innovation and productivity in a bigger sense that must be compromised if we all just do that.
You need a balance for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your favorite place that you've worked in?
Well, the incredible MMT. I mean, honestly, it really is just one company. So from the bedroom startup days, I absolutely and I'm hugely proud of that story. So it's really hard to sort of pick moments on that journey. I'm really loving where I am now to kind of get to still be part of all of that. But also, if you can't get out of bed and love being a chief sustainability officer, and I think everybody who works in my sphere is immensely positive, and maybe that's something we'll touch on, immensely positive about what we can do going forward. Because if you don't believe that we can fix this, then you wouldn't be doing it. You'd probably just be on a desert island, like living out the rest of your days. So if you can't love being a chief sustainability officer, there's not much hope for you. So I'm really loving what I'm doing right now.
Good. Yeah. And when you're not working, how do you spend your time?
I have 2 teenage girls who are 13 and 15, and a lovely wife. And between them, my girls, they take up most of my time. My wife is a personal trainer and obsessive with nutrition and fitness. And so I'm very grateful to her because she kind of drags me. We spend a lot of time doing yoga and working out, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, so just, the family keeps me out of trouble.
Nice. And do you think smart buildings are a step in the right direction towards working towards net zero?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'm a techie, right? And as I mentioned, I'm a computer scientist. So one of the things I'm hugely excited about is some of the latest, reports on climate change are still fairly doom and gloom. But if you look at technology's role in solving this, whether it's smart buildings, green nuclear energy, some of the more clever carbon capture techniques like direct air capture technologies that have been acknowledged, but quite rightly, not included in projections because we don't know when and how they're going to scale. But when you take all of these things that are going on and the money behind some of these initiatives at the moment, the investment in green initiatives, I think it's hugely exciting. And yeah, you've only got to look at the massive amount of energy consumed by across all our buildings. So to have smart buildings that can use that in a more sophisticated way, to have everything, air conditioning systems that shut down when grid emission factors go too high because we're not producing enough renewables to the grid. There's so many cool things that we can do. So yeah, absolutely, smart buildings.
And knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to your younger self?
So that's I've been asked that one a few times and in different ways. It's for me, it's always the imposter syndrome type answer when I think and social media is bad for this, and actually in the corporate world, LinkedIn can be just as bad. We all love that, but it can be lots of people posting articles about, look at me, look at how brilliant and clever I am. And whatever sphere you're working in, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't learn. And none of us have got all the answers. And I think definitely I spent many years feeling a bit insecure and a bit like crap and not good enough, and sitting in meetings and people using lots of fancy terms that I didn't understand. And you get to to a point where you become a bit of a grumpy old man, and you're just prepared to sort of go, like, I haven't got a clue what you just meant. Sorry, can you just explain that? And 5 other people are secretly going, oh God, yeah, I don't know.
Thank God you asked that.
So it's definitely always the imposter syndrome style answer. Just please, would be my message to any young people in the workforce. Please don't feel insecure about it. And we didn't have like LinkedIn and social media to make us feel even worse, about how not so good we were at our jobs. So yes, that would be my answer to that.
And I think that leads nicely as well into the next question, because just to think a little bit more about the kind of longer questions and where your interest in sustainability actually started, because I imagine now being in sustainability is because it's quite new as a job role, it's quite difficult to kind of find your feet and know what you should be doing. So like, where did that original interest begin?
I think like lots of people, like I say, I'm not it's not my academic background. I didn't study environmental sciences 20 years ago at uni or anything like that. But like a lot of people, so I'm, mid 40s, had my kids when I was late 20s. So, that's a point in your life where you're kind of thinking about longer term future of things. And I think I'd always been interested in it. Certainly going back to, whenever Al Gore's kind of Inconvenient Truth stuff came out, like pre-2008, because it was pre sort of the global crash, being really into sort of that and being really kind of shocked by some of that. But then I think like the rest of the world, the financial crash happened in 2008, and we kind of almost had this lost decade. We sort of almost, people talk about that in terms of it just sort of went off the radar. And to some extent, that was an initial concern with COVID hitting, was like, oh no, is this going to be so bad that we're going to lose another 10 years because we're going to have to focus on economic recovery and this isn't going to be important. So it was definitely there. But really, honestly, it wasn't until quite recently that I properly got into it, sort of 2017, 18, coming up to the 20th anniversary of my business. And I was chatting to my buddy, Ben, who I'd mentioned, and we were kind of going, there's got to be more to life than like, how much bigger can we get this company in terms of like money? There's got to be more to life than it. I said, I'll go and measure our carbon footprint. Like we started to see companies announcing a path to carbon neutrality, which is a term I didn't really understand. So I said, I'll go and measure our carbon footprint. I'll work out how we become carbon neutral. And I honestly thought I was going to Google it one afternoon and put some numbers into a calculator. And I think lots of people perhaps expect that. And that was the start of my journey, when I realized the terminology is so misunderstood. You have to understand about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Those terms didn't mean anything to me. Carbon neutral, carbon negative, climate positive, net zero. And we can get into this one a bit, but most people really don't know the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero. And I suspect that's possibly true of Boris Johnson, if I put the question to him, which is scary, because we're all talking about how important it is to get to net zero, but we can't actually define it. And then the calculators and the tools are really complicated. And I didn't, so I ended up having to build my own modeling tools. That they're still a bit of a mess, to be honest. There was a landscape of tools and out there, and I pieced a load of things together to build a calculator that worked for me. And I just kind of persevered and went on a journey and worked with it. And then I had to figure out how to offset. I didn't know what offsetting was. I didn't know if that was just tree planting. Is that just greenwashing? Where do you do it? How do you do it? What's verified offsetting? You have to learn about VCS and gold standard and all this sort of stuff. And I realized quite quickly that most SMEs were just really under-supported. I came across, 400-page PDFs from the greenhouse gas protocol on the 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. And nobody's going to read that unless you're a like advanced consultant working in this area. And so, I just went on a journey and figured this stuff out, and eventually, did measure our footprint, worked out as a professional service company that, like most service businesses, we have a very low carbon footprint. Relatively low. It was 600 or 700 tons, which is a number that meant nothing to me at the time. And we were a business of about 100 people at that point. And offsetting, which isn't the answer, can be quite cheap. We might sort of touch on that in a bit, but eventually worked all this stuff out. And then essentially that was the idea, to pitch to BEMA to become the co-chair of the Sustainability Council and say, look, this is a nightmare. I could run workshops for BEMA members and help them do this. And I've got all these calculators, and I open source them and put them up on a website. And I did that for a few years. And then earlier this year, I basically like wrote it all down, made it much more modular, and turned it into a free 6-week course that I launched on the Future Learn platform about 6 weeks ago, just simply called How to Measure, Reduce and Offset Your Company's Carbon Footprint. And it's just been kind of received with open arms, because, you know, wherever we are now, 4 years down the road on my journey, like the terminology still isn't understood. People don't know how to measure their footprint. They don't know what offsetting is, or how to do it, or where to do it, or if it's a good thing. And therefore they don't put in good reduction strategies because they haven't measured the thing they're trying to reduce. Sorry, I don't know. I think that was the answer to the question. But that was where my journey started. Not that long ago, but I was in a privileged place where I could, you know, and then MSQ have been incredible and just latched onto it and went, you know, that's amazing. We really want to do that. That's the future. Businesses need to behave like that. There's huge benefits to behaving like this, you know, and kind of gave me the scope to be able to kind of evangelize and do things like this and run the course as well as the work that I do internally.
Yeah, I've got to thank you on behalf of us as well for Future Learn, because it honestly has changed our entire kind of strategy in terms of net zero. I think we signed up about 3 months ago and we're at a bit of a loss. We did the thing that you said earlier, where it was like you sign up and you think that you can put some numbers in, and actually it's not like that. And then we came across Future Learn, and it's been so much easier. Since then.
That's great, and I'm delighted. But your stories are very similar, and the analogy I give is that, you know, if you went to a CEO of a business and said, "I've got a really great idea to halve your cost base," and he would go, "That's brilliant. Like, you've got a plan?" "Yeah, I've got a plan and a strategy and a team ready to go." Mm-hmm. If he said, "What is our cost base?" and your answer was, "I have no idea. How do you measure your cost base?" Right? He'd laugh you out of the room. But kind of that's what companies are doing, because it's difficult, but they want to get started. Most companies that I coached have often had or have sustainability policies. They have reduction policies, and when you get into it, they're just very focused on scope 2. It's like, oh, we make sure we turn the lights off, we make sure our laptops go to sleep, we have room sensors. Like, none of those things are bad, but you're probably, you know, your scope 2 emissions for a lot of companies are 4, 5, 6%, and you're maybe going to save a third of that. You know, great, you're kind of chucking bits of deck chairs off the Titanic, and so you need to go measure your scope 3 to some degree of accuracy.
I'm conscious about that maybe some people listening to this might not know what each scope is, so could you give us like a brief rundown of what each scope is and how difficult it is to measure?
Yeah, I'll give you a brief one. I'll keep it brief for scope 3, but it's scope 1 are what's called your direct emissions, and there's a lot of double accounting. So scope 1 are direct emissions. So the major one for most sort of companies would be, or just like, especially if you're a professional service company, would be gas. If you have gas supply to your office, because the gas is being piped into your building, you're combusting it in a boiler, and the emissions are coming directly out of your building. So gas. The other one is company owned cars, because you're burning the fuel in the car that the company owns and emitting it out. And then the other big one is, if you're a manufacturing company, your actual emissions from a factory. So direct emissions. Scope 2 is really easy. So scope 2 and 3 are indirect. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions from the purchase of electricity. So scope 2 is your electricity emissions. And if you think about it, it's different to gas. You're buying electricity from an energy company. It's being supplied to you. They're burning the fossil fuel, not you. And so it's an indirect emission. And this is where the double accounting starts to come in, because your scope 2 emissions will be an energy company's scope 1 emissions, et cetera. And then scope 3 emissions are everything else. Officially, there's 15 categories, and I will not step through all of those. But it's things like, it's the big one, and it's usually 90% of most companies' emissions. It's your staff commuting in and out of work. It's business travel between and around offices to meetings. It's things like home worker emissions. Like, that's a new one, an important post-COVID. And the big one is your supply chain, the purchase of goods and services. That'll be a massive one. And again, it's goods and services. People tend to focus on, oh, we should buy renewable paper and ink cartridges that are recyclable and things like that. Yes, you could do that, but it's professional goods and services. So, you know, HR, legal, finance, all the money that you spend on, you know, all of those sorts of things. It's that kind of, it's the supply chain emissions. So they all overlap. But it's really critical that we measure and focus on reducing all 3, because if you don't, it's just not going to happen, because if you just do scope 1, it puts way too much emphasis on a very small number of companies. And the only way they're going to be able to act, to be fair on them, is if we all act across all 3 scopes, because it'll drive investment into those areas. So a really obvious example of that is like, scope 2, your electricity. Well, we could sit around and do nothing and hope that the energy companies all start investing in renewable energy, and then it will just work out for us, right? And it will be zero. Or we could actively switch to a renewable energy company to put money in their pockets, so that we're all, as businesses, putting money into the right places, so investment gets put there. Money will make this stuff happen. And the same is true of scope 3. It puts money into the investment into the right parts of the supply chain. So
yeah,
there you go.
And there's been a shift, I guess, as well, in terms of legislation coming out recently, to kind of, I guess, push businesses along to do more for targeting net zero, or reporting on sustainability. And one of those is SECR, and we were kind of briefly chatting about this before the session. But it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that kind of new legislation that's coming in, and whether you think it actually works.
I think it will work to some degree. I'm sure we need some legislation. I don't think it's going to be the solution, and I will come back to that. So things like, SECR, and it's not really my area particularly, because that's more about legislation for financial reporting for larger companies, kind of large SMEs and above, to how they need to report on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And most of the kind of legislation that we've had in the past, and the stuff that's sort of being tightened up on, is around scope 1 and scope 2. That's not a bad thing, and it's certainly easier to focus on that. You can imagine from my definition of those things, that is much easier to kind of measure and audit those things. Certainly in terms of like gas and electricity, we can measure how many kilowatt hours you use. We can count, we can see how many company vehicles you've got, audit how many miles you've driven, look at your gas bills, look at your energy bills, and then you report on that. And that's easy. And we can look at how many kilowatt hours of electricity you generate, and then that's easy to convert into emissions. Every country has a thing called a grid emissions factor, which is just the grams of CO2 that get emitted for each kilowatt hour produced. Every country has a different one depending on how much they supply to the grid using renewables. So it's kind of easy. The problem with like reporting or putting legislation in place for reporting on scope 3, well, you can do it. You can say, like, legally you have to report on your scope 3 emissions. It's the auditing of that. It's so complicated. It's not necessarily complicated, because I don't want to put people off. Like, you can go on my course and I give you lots of simple ways of measuring your scope 3, but there are lots of different approaches, especially to supply chain. You can use spend-based models. You can go and survey your whole supply chain, which nobody's going to do in year 1, and ask them what their emissions are. That's not necessarily more accurate, because what if 10 companies tell you what their emissions are? Are you going to audit how they measured those emissions? And part of that will be their supply chain emissions.
Yeah.
And so how did they calculate that? And are you going to go all the way down the supply chain forever? Like, you're going to blow your mind. So yes, you can sort of legislate to say you have to report on it. What's much more difficult / possibly infeasible is, standardizing, how those things are measured. I'm hesitating, because it's not that you can't do it, and I'm sure that there will be movements towards doing it, but we cannot spend the next 10 years farting about with just making really complicated models and measurement tools and legislation, and then trying to make that global, because this is a global thing. Like, so the UK can legislate it. And like, look, part of like the problem with even reporting at a country level, right? Yeah. Countries don't report in a kind of scope 1, 2, 3 way, right? So the UK, I'll give you an example. Like, so the UK has a pretty good carbon emissions on a per head basis, right? We look at the US, I think it's like, I don't know, 12 to 18 tons per head, and the UK is sort of 7 to 8. You see sort of different numbers. You go, oh, that's good. Like, we're way better. And actually, you then go and look at China and India, who like have quite big emissions, but they got very low emissions per head. India in particular, like very low emissions per head, and that's like really important. But one of the reasons that the UK's emissions are so low on a per head basis is partly because we've decimated our manufacturing base over the last 50 years. Right, that's our kind of UK emissions, but we import so much from these other countries. We've just pushed our manufacturing emissions over there. So the whole legislation bit is just really complicated for businesses. It's really complicated for countries. Personally, because I'm operating mostly, I guess, in the SME space, and 99% of businesses in the UK are SMEs. We just need simple ways of getting moving quickly. And the reason that I don't necessarily think we need legislation, and this is what I think is different to 10 years ago, is that there's a massive win-win for businesses. So at the moment, the narrative is quite, if you look at the media particularly, it's kind of like, it's on government. It's like angry people getting angry at government. And the narrative is about like, what can government do? Or what can individuals do? If you look at what you're asking individuals to do, you're asking them to go, right, well, you need to cut down on red meat, you need to fly less, you need to buy an electric vehicle, you need to drive less, you need to cycle to work. And you probably need to think about insulating your house and maybe spending thousands of pounds on a boiler. Now, the benefit to you that's got a lot of cost and time and effort. And the benefit to you doing that is that like our species might survive in 100 years. Now that seems like a pretty good motivation, but it's not, right? Because our brains don't work like that. Yeah. Like that's not a threat. Our brains are quite primitive, and like we're geared up to dealing with lions like jumping out at us. So I think we could probably admit that if there was a meteorite crashing to Earth in the next year, we'd probably mobilize much more quickly than we are right now, because that's more like a lion. Like that's quite a threat.
COVID is a perfect example of that.
COVID is a great example of that, and that's where messaging to the public, hands, face, space, etc., kind of works, because there's an actual threat and people are actually dying and hospitals are so it does work. But there was a leaked report from developed for the UK government recently by some behavioural scientists that basically went, look, hands, face, space and stuff can work, but really it's unlikely to drive like mass change with climate change, because whilst there are lots of lovely individual people, humans are basically kind of selfish, and we just won't move. But for good reasons. We're trying to people are living in poverty, they're trying to give a better life to their kids, and yes, okay, obviously we need a planet for that to be the case, but people just don't think in those terms. So that's a problem. But actually, and businesses are quite selfish too, obviously. There's some nice businesses, lots of nice businesses, but when you're talking at scale, businesses are also quite selfish. But there's a win-win for businesses. So if businesses, have a path to net zero, operate as a sort of purpose, value-driven, purpose-driven business, path to net zero, develop more sustainable products and services for their clients. There's so many benefits. I mean, we see it anecdotally, and we're starting to measure it in terms of people choosing to come to work for MSQ or choosing to stay to work. We have staff schemes, cycle to work scheme, electric vehicle lease hire schemes, staff offsetting schemes, like all these things that we can do as a business that don't really cost that much money. But they have a real benefit. They do have a benefit to the business. It's easier to hire. We can retain great talent. And as we want to attract a younger and younger demographic into the workforce, that has even, more benefits. Our clients are all doing the same. We're in the supply chain for our clients. So they want, suppliers with a path to net zero. So it's easier with pitching and winning work off the back of our sustainability work. As a digital agency, we're looking at how we build lower carbon digital solutions, because the internet has a larger carbon footprint than the airline industry. So we're talking about those to our clients.
I didn't know that.
It's huge, and it's rising very, very quickly, whereas the airline industry is in decline. It's massive. So, we're leading the charge on that, and that can be a real value add to us in a competitive market. So benefits with our clients, benefits to our staff. And there's reports coming, there's a recent report from Accenture showing that the companies, and this is obviously skewed towards larger businesses who are trending upwards on their sustainability metrics. Now that's broader than just environmental sustainability. That's, diversity, inclusion, ethics, social good, but they're all fairly linked. Those that are trending up on those metrics are also trending up at a similar amount on their EBITDA, on their underlying profitability. Companies that are B Corp certified are growing something like 28 times faster than average GDP growth. There's all sorts of, now So when there's a win-win, when there's a cost, but there's also a benefit, companies will go at this. And I'm really seeing this. This is why I'm very positive, both on the company's ability to innovate, because there's huge amounts of money involved if you can produce an incredibly efficient electric, heating, cooling system, or, incredibly, be involved in smart buildings, or, whatever it is you do, there's huge benefits. But also, businesses employ a very large population of the planet. And there's things that we can do by behaving like this. And I work, big part of what I do with MSQ is looking at these spheres of influence. And there's three big spheres of influence. There's our clients that I've mentioned, like how can we kind of have lower carbon digital service offerings for them? There's other companies, SMEs, so our sector and beyond. So that's the Future Learn course. How can we help our clients? How can we help other companies? And then the third big sphere of influence is our staff. And as I say, there's loads of cool stuff we can do there, and we're just getting started. We've got staff renewable energy schemes, and we've got electric vehicle lease hire, salary sacrifice schemes can save you 40% off the monthly cost of an electric vehicle, thanks to sort of UK tax law that's come in. We've had the cycle to work scheme for years, but I think going forwards there'll be more and more things like, can businesses also help subsidize and promote and encourage people to move away from gas boilers? We're perhaps not there yet, but the technology will evolve. There's grants coming, and then businesses can do more. And that's where I think the narrative has to shift. The media kind of loves to look at people gluing themselves to motorways who are angry about the government. So the narrative goes back to people angry with government needs to fix it. Government can do a lot because they can put legislation in place to mobilize businesses, like tax brace for electric vehicles. I think we need the equivalent of the R&D tax credits for environmental stuff. I think certain types of offsetting could be tax free. There's definitely more stuff that we can do, and that's our focus for our BEMA COP workshops. So I've gone off on a bit of a rant there.
No, it's fine.
I think there was a question in there, but it was
you're
about
right.
reporting. But the key bit is not legislating. Legislating will get you so far, but we have to move really quickly. And the way you tend to move quickly, in business, if you can find a win-win, that's great. And that's why I'm excited, because I think more than ever now, there are win-wins for businesses, going at this really quickly.
And I guess that's kind of what Tech Zero, and that's kind of how we met through this Tech Nation Tech Zero network. And in a sense, it's an opposite to legislation in that you opt in and you want to do it. Do you think that's a way more effective way of getting people on board with doing kind of on the path to net zero, rather than kind of forcing their hand through legislation?
I absolutely think it is, to get there quickly, we need to move quickly. So if we can make the narrative about how beneficial this is for your business, and I think that's getting out there, right? I think that a lot of CEOs and C-suites and exec teams are realizing this. And as I say, there's Accenture reports are one example, but pick any major consultancy, McKinsey, PwC, go and Google it. There's mountains of information out there about how important it is to put sustainability. It's not CSR. It's not a page on your website about what the good stuff that you do now, right? I report very directly up into the MSQ board. It's absolutely front and center, alongside sustainability more broadly, like diversity and inclusion, etc. But this is how we need to operate as a business if we want to attract the best possible people, as well as it being the right thing to do. So I think it's getting the message out there that there are these huge win-wins. And then where we need legislation is, I think, more like around tax laws and taxation to sort of drive the right behavior for individuals, like grants for boilers and all that sort of stuff. But also for environmental sustainability, as I say, that something like R&D tax credits, which have been around for a long time, to encourage businesses to research and innovate and develop new technologies, and that benefits us all and drives growth in the UK economy. So we have R&D tax credits. I think we need something broad and general like that to encourage businesses to do more in terms of their sustainability activities. So yeah.
And do you think it's possible for every company to achieve net zero?
Well, I think first of all, Like, yeah, I mean, absolutely. First of all, we've got to make sure we've got a clear definition of net zero. And I think that's still coming. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that we don't necessarily. The best I've got is, I mean, and just, you know, I'm not, for people who maybe are thinking, actually, I don't know the difference between net zero and carbon neutral or carbon neutrality. Just, you know, so carbon neutral, as you'd expect, is if you've measured your carbon footprint and you've worked out what that is, and then you've done some offsetting, verified offsetting. That's usually, actually, it's usually not tree planting. It's usually protecting deforestation in the first place, or investment in renewable energy projects. And there are all sorts of schemes you can support with debatable impact. Like we can come back to that. And so you offset. Now, the other challenge with carbon neutrality is that you can, historically, because there are official certifications you can get, one called PAS 2060, you can certify for carbon neutrality across just scope 1 and scope 2. So when I was talking about those definitions, so someone can be carbon neutral unless you lift the hood and go, well, is that for scope 1, 2, and 3, or just 1 and 2? Like, you have to be a bit careful. So that muddies the water there. But basically, carbon neutrality is, we know what our footprint is, we've measured it, and then we're offsetting. And then you've got things like carbon negative, where you're just offsetting more than you measured. Net zero is confusing because it sounds the same, and from a net position it is, because we're not saying zero emissions, right? We're saying net zero emissions. So if you think about it, it's like, oh, well, is that the same as carbon neutrality? It's not. Fundamentally, it's not. Like, offsetting is not a scalable solution. We cannot offset our way out of this. We have to reduce the emissions significantly. So net zero requires a significant reduction in emissions. And that's a bit of a woolly term, but most would agree it's probably in line with sort of science-based targets, which I won't kind of get into necessarily, but it's a very significant reduction, reducing as much as possible, and then offsetting just the small amount that's left. We still need some better definitions of what we mean by as much as possible, and making sure everybody agrees that means in line with science-based targets, and what type of offsetting we're going to allow for that last bit. So it's a very good question, but I think the first thing to do is call out, first of all, before we're going to work out whether we can achieve it, we need to make sure everybody understands what it is. Beyond that, like, absolutely. It really depends from company to company. Like, for some companies, for sure, it's much more difficult if they've got very, very complicated manufacturing, and they're making something very specifically out of a very specific metal or something that's very difficult to do anything else with. Now, again, it depends on this term net zero. Like, it may be that they have to reduce elsewhere for professional service companies like ourselves. It's just like, right, well, we don't have electric vehicles, we'll get rid of gas. We don't need gas. Most offices don't have gas. We'll switch our other offices onto renewable energy, which zeros your emissions on a market-based measurement, because we're buying it all from renewable sources. And then we pick off our supply chain. Post-COVID, well, for us professional services, that's okay. We can reduce commuting. Business travel has gone down anyway. And the longer term thing, we just need to start to pick through our supply chain. And as long as they're all doing the things that I've just mentioned, like, we'll probably get there. For those very kind of complex areas, I think, and again, I touch on this in the course, so I won't go into it too much, but there's offsetting and there's offsetting, right? So offsetting, let's just touch on that for a sec. It gets a bad rap in that, look, some of it, and we do a lot of this, and it's not that it's a bad thing to do, it's a really good thing to do, We use an offsetting partner called Ecology, and they're wonderful, but their projects can be around about the sort of £4 per tonne. And they're verified, as I said, VCS Gold Standard are the two most common ones. But, for example, protecting forests, well, that sounds great, but they're debatable in the fact that some of the modeling where they've like extrapolated how much forest will be cut down, and therefore if we protect this bit, we model that it would have been cut down, so that counts. Now, that's okay, but if all that's happening is you've protected a little bit here and you've moved the problem 50 kilometers up the road in this forest, and it's hard, even though the verified schemes, that they can't necessarily be on site everywhere. So you might have just moved the problem 50 kilometers up the road. So, you've got to be a little bit careful. Plus, the forest that you've protected might burn down next year, ironically, because of climate change, right? So I'm not saying, I want to get the narrative right, because sometimes people take a jump from that and go, oh, it's a waste of money. It's not. Let's all do that because it puts billions in really good places. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'm talking about sort of £600 or £700 per ton. So remember, £400 per ton up to £600 or £700 per ton. And there's some brilliant stuff in the middle, around about 100 tons. You get these more modern kind of direct air capture schemes where they're literally basically sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, doing it in an energy efficient way, because if you can't do it in an energy efficient way, the emissions for doing it cancel out the point of doing it, injecting that into rocks or mineralizing it and sinking it. And so, you know, for example, Porsche a couple of weeks ago announced a sort of, I would call it almost net zero fuel. It's a carbon neutral fuel, and it's a synthetic fuel that has exactly the same emissions out of the tailpipe of the car. So it's no better than normal fuel in that regard. But the way it's made, the synthetic fuel is not made from fossil fuel. It's made from essentially a process that uses direct air capture to pull CO2 out. So the process for creating the fuel is carbon negative because it's using direct air capture to create the fuel. And then the emissions that come out the back of the car just balance that out. Yeah. Now that's awesome. Like, it's not a solution, but you know, if it helps in the short term with, you know, internal combustion engines, and the same thing could be said of the airline industry. Yeah. It's not that I'm not a fan of offsetting your flights. You should do that. But really, airlines should be using direct air capture to offset their flights, but they won't, because, you know, flying to Spain per person probably does emit 1 ton. And so they're okay to offset, you know, the cheaper ones because they can afford £2 or £3. It's probably less than that when they buy at scale, but they can't afford, they're not going to spend £600, because what's that going to do to a £49.99 Ryanair flight to Malaga? Do you know what I mean? So yeah. Yes, we can get there, and I think the IPCC report quite rightly painted a grim picture because they're excluding carbon capture technologies, and they're right to do so because we haven't scaled them yet. But I'm kind of excited about the role that they can play. Yeah, we can definitely get there.
Yeah, is there anything like, that's a really cool bit of tech? Is there any more like innovative products that are on your radar that you think are going to be really, really useful in the future?
The one that always springs to mind, and it's, you know, it's not something that's like, I mean, anybody who watched kind of the Bill Gates documentary will have seen this, but there's a company called TerraPower. They bill themselves as a nuclear innovation company, and essentially, if you've seen the documentary, you know, what basically the designs for nuclear power stations have been the same since whenever we first started designing nuclear power stations. And we all know from like the disasters in Japan, places like that, where essentially what happened there was that the tsunami crashed over, took out all the generators that were keeping everything cool. And when the cooling fails, these things are working at very high pressure, the pressure builds up and things explode. So these new designs from TerraPower operate using atmospheric pressure. So if things fail, the most catastrophic failure event will just mean that the plant stops producing electricity. But also the design actually uses existing nuclear waste rather than, you know, creating more nuclear waste. And the end of the documentary is kind of cool. It shows this big sweep of a nuclear waste facility in Turkey and says there's enough nuclear waste here to power the United States for the next 150 years, which is incredible, isn't it? That's just one little thing, and there's millions of these little innovations that are coming along, which is, you know, why I'm optimistic.
Yeah, very cool. Is that the one on Netflix? I think I've seen one of the Bill Gates documentaries, but I don't know.
There's that series of 4 about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Yeah, I don't think I got
sanitary, and one on polio, and one on, and if you watch one on climate change.
Okay.
You know, there's that one. But like little things, I saw one the other day, a guy who developed the whitest paint. Right? And it was the most reflective white paint ever developed. And the idea of it is that you paint it on the top of buildings. And it's so incredibly reflective. And this is, you know, it's well documented that part of the problem is like with the polar ice caps, you know, shrinking in, you've got less white reflective surface, which is reflecting heat away, and that kind of creates a feedback loop. And the idea is you paint this stuff on the top of buildings. And I forget, I don't have the numbers to hand, but the sort of equivalent kilowatt hours of cooling equivalent, like, is just phenomenal. So you've got, nuclear powered stuff, but people
Yeah.
developing white paint. I saw a new design for wind turbine, right, which was like a wall. So instead of for a city, so you make a wall that has these panels that just spin round.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
it looks really nice, but you just
Yeah.
make all your walls out of stuff that just sort of like spin round and generate power. So there's some really, really cool stuff coming.
Sometimes it's the simplest solutions as well that are the best.
Paint. White paint's going to save us all.
I'm definitely going to look into that. That sounds really
good. I'll dig that one out.
Great.
Cool.
Well, I think that's probably about time. But it's been, amazing having you on, James. Thank you so much for your time and sharing all of your knowledge with us. It's been great.
No, thank you. I hope there's some little nuggets in there. If it was overwhelming, and I apologize if I sound like I'm flogging it, it's a free course, but the Future Learn course that I've got, it just covers that terminology and the measurement and the offsetting and what you can do next and science-based targets. So I know I kind of, that was a real whistle stop, and part of the reason I did what I've done is because it can be a bit overwhelming. And so my messaging is always not, listen to me, aren't we doing great stuff at MSQ? It's sort of the messaging is like, oh, we're doing great stuff at MSQ. It's not that hard. Here's how you can do it. And I'm keen to get that message across on things like this as well. So, I don't know if people can find the link, or maybe
we'll definitely share it. We'll share it in, hopefully someone will share it in the comments now, but we can also share it on all over social as well. Thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see everyone in the next couple of weeks for our next PropTech Ramble. Cool. Thank you.